My next guest is Molly Crabapple, who will be speaking to us about the little-known story of the Jewish Labor Bund, a secular anti-Zionist revolutionary movement that emerged in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, peaking in Warsaw in 1939. Molly Crabapple is an artist and writer in New York. She is the author of 2 books, Drawing Blood and Brothers of the Gun, which was longlisted for a National Book Award in 2018. Her reportage has been published in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, Vanity Fair, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. Her art is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art. Her animated short, A Message from the Future, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has been nominated for an Emmy Award in the category of Outstanding News Analysis, Editorial and Opinion. She'll be speaking to us about the little-known story of the Jewish Labor Bund, a secular anti-Zionist revolutionary movement that emerged in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, peaking in Warsaw in 1939. She joins us from New York. Molly Crabapple, thank you for joining us. I had the pleasure of reading through one of your essays from the New York Review of Books from 2018, and I was struck by this myth that you had uncovered. I wouldn't really call it a myth, perhaps, but it definitely appeared that way for me, and there was a sense of discovery, something that I hadn't really heard about. How did you come to the Jewish Labor Bund as a concept?
I came to the Jewish Labor Bund through my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather, Sam Rothbard, was a painter who came to America from Belarus in 1904. And I grew up completely surrounded by his paintings. After him, most people on my mom's side of the families had been artists in one way or another. He had taught my mom how to draw. My mom taught me to draw. And so I grew up feeling very connected with him, even though I had never met him. During the Holocaust, his hometown of Volkovisk in Belarus was completely annihilated. And he wasn't able to save any of the people he knew. But as an act of preservation, I want to say, he instead did a series of hundreds of paintings of his memories of what that hometown was like. They're almost journalistic, I want to say, and they cover every aspect of life, from the religious to the mundane, from bad kids in school sneaking cigarettes to Jewish girls making out with Russian soldiers behind the fence, to choral singers on Yom Kippur. You know, a full picture of this vanished world. And he had one painting that, when I first saw it, it completely struck me because it was so different from how I imagined a life for a Jewish woman would be in a small town like he came from. It was a picture of a girl with her hair in an updo, wearing a purple dress and skirt, corseted waist, almost like a little bustle, long skirt, 19th century. And she's out at night on the streets, and she's throwing a rock through a window. And next to her is her boyfriend, who's holding a bag full of rocks, because a lady shouldn't have to carry her own rocks should she want to break some windows late at night. And I looked at the title, and it said, Itka the Bundist. I was, Itka, old Yiddish name, but Bundist, what's that? And it was that question, that curiosity, that led me to learn about the Jewish Labor Bund, which was a secular, socialist, and anti-Zionist organization that was once the most popular Jewish political party in Poland, the largest, the country with the largest Jewish community in Europe, but whose legacy had been completely erased from memory.
In 1902, the Bund was Russia's only Jewish revolutionary party. By 1904, it had 35,000 members. The group finds their first sort of mission in Volkovisk. Anti-Zionism seems to be a fundamental principle within the ideas of the Bund. Was that something that originated with the origination of the group itself?
Absolutely. And initially, the Bund's anti-Zionism, it actually didn't come so much from thinking about Palestinians. It came from the idea that Zionism was first delusional, right? The idea that millions and millions of people would go and leave their lives and their countries and their homes and their families and go to a place that they had never been and completely reconstruct it. To the Bund, this sounded like a hallucination. But the second reason was that they viewed Zionists as collaborating with anti-Semites, because anti-Semites also believed that Jews had no place in Europe, and also believed that all the Jews should leave and go somewhere else, maybe Palestine. And Zionists at various points in their history agreed with these anti-Semitic parties and political leaders, and some Zionist leaders even collaborated with them. So that was the Bund's first point of rejection of Zionism, and they rejected it from the very first moments of their foundation, and even before, when they were just Jewish socialists and not an official group. I remember I was reading a memoir of Patty Kramer, who is the wife of the founder of the Bund, and she just casually describes him when he's coming back, I think he's coming back from like some sort of prison sentence somewhere in Russia. And he just stops at this town and he gets into a public debate with a Zionist. And she says he humiliated him and he turned his ideas to ash. That was how Patty Kramer described what her husband did.
Because you say that it was treated as almost delusional, this concept that people would uproot themselves willingly and move to another place. And yet you also write that the Bund was often characterized as naive idealism, whose concept of here-ness, which we're going to get to, lost its argument to the Holocaust. So it's almost as if the roles shifted and flipped after the Holocaust, that it became the Bund itself. And I think we should talk a little bit about its original ideas and some of its experiences, but almost became the one that was naive in a world that you described, which was fanned by skillful Zionist propaganda, caused among the Jews a psychosis of Zionist and messianistic illusions, deeply aggrieved and shaken by the murder of 6 million of their brethren.
I don't think it's fair to say that after the Holocaust, I don't think that the Bund was naive. I think that no one imagined that the Nazis or any other movement was going to kill 2/3 of all of the Jews in Europe. And in the case of Poland, which is where the Bund was strongest, of the Jews that stayed in Poland that weren't able to flee to the Soviet Union, 97% were killed. So it was that you had a people that was they were murdered, right? They were annihilated, and they were annihilated to almost a complete degree. And in Poland, which is where the Bund came from, which was where the Bund had its strength, it was not possible for most Jews to live after the war because of lynchings by anti-Semites of Jews that returned to their homes. And so you had a situation where there was a mass migration of the surviving Jewish community. I think it was like a little under 300,000 people survived the war out of 3 million Jews. This community fled to the displaced persons camps in Germany, which the American occupied zone of Germany. And when they were in those camps, they sat and they applied for visas to other countries. And those countries, by and large, rejected them. There was an attempt by Bundists and Jewish trade unionists and their allies to get America to give 400,000 visas to Jewish Holocaust survivors. And it was refused because of the idea that these Jewish survivors maybe were communists. And so what happened afterwards is you have these people that are stuck there 1 year, 2 years in some stinking refugee camp, just like refugees are now. And then you have a radical group that promises them that through violence, they can redeem their dignity. And also that they can get out of that camp and they can go somewhere else to restart their lives. And that's how I characterize the Haganah afterwards. And I think that what happens is something that's happened to many refugee groups throughout history. They took up that offer, or, well, not all of them, but many people took up that offer because the rest of the world had not been willing to give them a place to live and not been willing to give them a place where they could live in dignity. But you will find that many people who ended up on illegal Haganah boats to Palestine were people who had applied for visas to go live in New York first. Oh
You
my
found
God,
this in
yeah,
your research?
it's a well-known thing. Very often getting on a smuggling boat was a last resort. I was reading one book by a Bundist named Yaakov Pat. He was from Bialystok. He was able to escape to America, but his whole family was killed. And he goes back to Poland after the war in like 1946 to give aid to the survivors. And first, he just talks about like the complete decimation of the community. He goes back to Bialystok, which before the war, 15,000 people had voted for the Bund. After the war, he meets the guy who is running the Bialystok Bund, who's now a guy who survived Auschwitz. And he asks the guy, like, how many people are in it? And the guy says that there are 23 people. Think of that, from 15,000 to 23 because of the level of mass murder. And also just, people having to survive after. And Yaakov Pat was very involved in the effort to get American visas for Jews so that they could come to New York. Jews wanted to largely live in established Jewish communities. They felt very distrustful of other people. And New York was one of those biggest of those communities in the world. And he says at the end of his book that in Poland, you can hear the ships. And whether those ships are going to Palestine or to America, he doesn't know. And in my opinion, the reason that the Haganah and the Organ and other militias like that were able to basically convince enough refugees in order to come to Palestine after the war was in large part because other countries were shamefully unwilling to take refugees. And I think it's the exact same thing that you see now with countries being unwilling to take refugees.
You mention a lot this notion, which I guess from what I'm understanding is we can sort of separate probably not just the Bundist narrative, but the Jewish narrative in general as before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, as it relates to many of the ideas that we're talking about. One of them being this notion of here-ness as a philosophical concept, that the diaspora was home. And is there a doctrine that you write was created by the godless Jews of the diaspora, written with Mongol words and Hebrew letters, then spread by itinerant troublemakers carrying forged passports whose fundamental demand was the right to stay? What does here-ness mean in our age of mass migration, you ask? And can you just describe and elaborate on the notion itself?
The notion of here-ness, the way that the Bund meant it, was that the place that you live now was your country. And this was something that was quite challenging to the notions of the day, because the Bund they came about in Russia, which was probably the most anti-Semitic place in Europe. It was a place that viewed Jews as fundamentally alien. It did not view Tsarist
This
Russia.
is Tsarist
Yeah.
Russia, right? So late 19th century.
There were all sorts of specific, race laws that related to Jews, especially about where they could live, how many could go to school, army conscription, stuff like that. And Tsarist Russia did not view Jews as an assimilatable part of Russia, unless perhaps they converted to Christianity. And even then it was like pretty dodgy. And so by the same token, a lot of the sort of, traditional Jewish religious notion, the religious, like very, very Orthodox notion was that Jews, are people in exile, right? They call it the Golas. And that, one day the Messiah will come and bring them back to, the promised land, and the dead will rise and all of that. And so also the religious notion didn't view Jews as belonging to the places where they were. And the Bund's notion of here-ness was like, no, that's not true at all. We have lived in this land for 1,000 years. This land is our land just as much as anyone else who lives here. We have a right to it. It's our home. The right to live somewhere in freedom and dignity and in your full identity doesn't come from some mythical link between blood and soil. That is your right as a human, and that your home is the ground beneath your feet. And that's something that I still believe is true. And it's something that I think is incredibly, incredibly important, particularly in a world that still wants to sort people out as you come from here and you come from there and your people come from here and so you should live there, blah blah blah, and wants to slice the world apart with borders and by passports and by blood. And the Bund's view is a complete rejection of that.
A lot of the ideas resonate. They seem to resonate also looking at a contemporary context, because we are dealing in a time of re-evaluation in a way. I think even the American Jewish community, at least in terms of younger generational collectives, coming together, standing against things that just go against sort of the mainstream expectations, let's say, in society. With groups like If Not Now, trying to fight the occupation through sort of civil rights movements. Do you think that there are a lot of these ideas that have been erased to a degree that serve a purpose, an intellectual purpose, or even a spiritual purpose for contemporary people?
100%. I did a panel at YIVO, which is like an Eastern European Jewish history center here, about the Bund with a few other scholars. Not that I'm a scholar, but they were scholars. They told me, one of the most packed events they ever had. And when I looked at the audience, it wasn't like a typical YIVO audience. Typically, the audiences there, they tend to be more older people and academics. This audience was filled with young people, young, like 20-year-old punks with, neon green hair and like ACAB shirts, right? So I think that there's a generation of Jews that are looking back into their history, and they're looking for sort of spiritual forebearers that, first of all, are anti-Zionist. And because young Jews, grow up with Arab friends, and the idea that like the answer for us is like moving to an apartheid state and oppressing like the people that, it's inane, right? If you grow up in New York. But by the same token, Jews, have, a lot of us have absorbed this really negative myth that was largely created by Zionists, which was that Jews were weak and cowardly and unmanly, and just sort of like passively lay down and took it and went like sheep to the slaughter throughout history. And the culmination of that was, Jews being all murdered in the Holocaust, but that it wasn't just that, like that it was our whole history since we went into the diaspora. We had just been like weak little cowards, right? And that what redeemed Jewish strength and Jewish courage and Jewish masculinity really was Israel, and going and getting a gun and oppressing some Palestinians.
Right.
And this myth is so corrosive and evil. First of all, it's evil because you don't derive manhood by running an apartheid state. But second of all, it's evil because it's filled with self-hatred, right? It's saying that like all of your ancestors were weak little cowards who kind of deserved it. And I think especially, at this moment where there's rising anti-Semitic attacks, a lot of young Jews are looking for an identity that's both, or not an identity, I should say, but they're looking for ancestors that both were anti-Zionists, but also were proud Jews who stood up for themselves and protected each other. And, also fought back, and also were tough and strong and brave. And I think the reason for the Bund's popularity now is that it combines those two things.
You write about that. You write that there's a myth that before Israel, Jews did not fight. Even Hannah Arendt, making her controversial claim that Jewish leadership collaborated across the board with Nazis, falls into this error. The Bund, the elected leadership of Europe's largest Jewish community, fought from the first day of the occupation to the last, and they fought throughout the war.
Exactly. Arthur Ziegelbaum, who was one of the Bund's leaders, he, the Nazis kind of kidnapped him, or not like they kind of blackmailed him into serving on the first Judenrats. Judenrats were the Jewish organizational bodies that the Nazis set up. So the first Judenrat, it was before there was the ghetto, and it was before they were doing anything particularly horrific. And when he heard that the ghetto was going to be set up, he gave a public speech where he was like, do not go to the ghetto, fight, don't get into do not leave your homes, do not, don't go along with it, right? And then he had to go underground, and he escaped to England, and he actually later killed himself in protest for the world's inaction. But the Jews at every moment, the Jews in the Bund, and some Jews in other groups as well, they did fight back. It's just, the thing is that, it's one of the things that angers me, right, is there's this self-hatred that Jews sometimes have, like, why didn't we defeat the Nazis? No one defeated the Nazis. The French army didn't defeat the Nazis. The Polish army didn't defeat the Nazis. The Belgian army, the Dutch army. I mean, it took the combined wealth of America and 20 million dead Soviets and everyone else in the world to defeat the Nazis. Like, why are people even asking why, a small minority of 9 million people
Right.
didn't defeat the Nazis all by themselves? It's ridiculous. It's very insulting, I feel.
But as you're saying, it suits the narrative that has been propagated for political reasons.
Exactly. And I mean, the thing with Zionism as a movement is, despite the fact that many Jews in Europe were Zionists before the war, that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted to actually go live in Palestine. It very often reminded me of people who say that they will lose weight next summer, or that have all sorts of commitments that they don't actually realize, that they don't actually aim to fulfill. I mean, the Zionists had until 1939 with the White Paper, right, to make their case to Jews to move to Palestine. And by and large, Jews didn't. There were less Jews in Palestine in 1941 than there were in the Warsaw Ghetto. So the notion that Palestine was going to be like the place that the 9 million Jews of Europe would have gone to be safe is, I don't think, realistic. But it's something that is sort of pushed in retrospect.
And Warsaw saw a romantic flourishing of the movement at its height, right? The Bundist unions, you write, represented around 100,000 Jews, but obviously it was also the scene of some of the greatest tragedies.
Warsaw was, the cultural capital of Poland, and it was, during the interwar years, the place where the Bund was really at its height. And what was interesting about the Bund was it was able to create in that moment a complete culture. It had powerful trade unions. It had a political party, which was allied with the Polish Socialist Party, which had like city councillors and representatives, in power. It also created a network of secular Yiddish schools. It created one of the most popular sports clubs in the entire country that like participated in the Workers' Olympics. It had choruses. It had like allied publishers. It had multiple newspapers. It had childcare. It had children's groups, like one that was like for little kids called Skiff. It was like a Boy and Girl Scouts type thing, but socialist. And then they also had like Zukunft, which was much more like, for like 18-year-olds. They also had a paramilitary. And the paramilitary did defend against anti-Semitic attacks, but it didn't just do that. It also did things like defending a poor family when their landlord wanted to throw them out for not paying the rent. It provided a complete world for its members that was really based on like working class minority pride in a country that was, pretty severely anti-Semitic. I mean, Poland during the interwar years had a political party called the Endax that wanted to colonize Madagascar and send all the Jews there. This is one of their brilliant ideas, So the fact that the Bund was so popular was really in addition to making real economic gains and, fighting political fights for people, it was really a statement of pride, of people saying, I'm poor and I'm working class, I'm Jewish, I work at a sweatshop, and that's okay. Like I have dignity, I have strength, and I'm creating something beautiful. And I mean, one of the things that the Bund, well, not the Bund itself, but that Bundists were very involved in, that was created in Vilna, was something that's still alive today, which is called YIVO, which is a center for the study of Eastern European Jewish history. And when they created this, it wasn't created necessarily by like professional academics, and it specifically wanted to get away from the idea that history, Jewish history or any other history, is just the story of kings and prominent religious men and rich people. They wanted to tell the story of of the working class Jewish people that they came from, and a lot of the sort of sociological research they did was just carried out by ordinary working class people. And this institute that Bundists were so involved in, when the Nazis took over Vilna, they got Jewish archivists, some of them who were Bundists. They wanted them to take the collection of the institute, sort out like the good stuff to send to a museum of extinct Jews in Germany, and then burn the rest. And these archivists, they risked their lives, they risked everything in order to smuggle out as much of the collection as they possibly could so it wouldn't be destroyed. And I want to say they saved about a third of the collection against impossible odds, and that's in New York right now. I mean, that's what one of my main things I used to do my research.
And you did find an incredible impact in New York, right? I mean, there was several figures who have been commemorated in different ways in New York City, and so who made an impact in the United States as well.
Absolutely. After the failed revolution in 1905, there was, a huge repression of revolutionaries, especially Jewish ones, and quite a number of Bundist radicals, they came to America. And that's where you get figures like the great labor leaders, David Dubinsky, who ran the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or Sidney Hillsman, or Baruch Charny Vladeck, who is a socialist who was very involved with housing in New York. And it's interesting because you have like buildings named after Vladeck in New York. And Vladeck is not his real name, it's his revolutionary name. He kept that. It's his nom de guerre.
His nom de guerre.
Or you have like, a school named after Hillsman, or you have a prize named after Hillsman, or you have, all of these traces all over the city, but they kind of, people don't know what they are anymore, right? They're any more than people would know that most people in the West know that Gibraltar comes from Jebel Tariq, and it comes from, Tariq bin Ziyad. It's like just as foreign from most people's consciousness. And for me,
Right.
like the most amazing sort of unknown Bundist legacy in New York is that there's a Jewish cemetery in Queens that I've been to quite a few times, and it has a socialist section. It has a socialist section, and it's amazing because like in the socialist section, instead of having like religious symbols on the tombstones, they have a hand that's holding the torch of human reason, and so it's all the Jewish socialists are there, and they have all the Bundist tombstones, and and not just Bundists, but like Jewish socialist leaders' tombstones and Menshevik tombstones and all of this, like just one after the other. But the thing is that they are written in Yiddish, and almost no one speaks Yiddish anymore. And the people who do speak Yiddish are, in New York in general, they're ultra-Orthodox people who are not interested in atheistic socialist movements.
Right. How did you work on your Yiddish and get to a point where you felt comfortable in your research?
Man, it was hard. I was very lucky that YIVO allowed me to take a summer program that they have, which is, I think it's considered the top summer program. People come all over the world to do it. And it's just this like super intensive, immersion. You spend all your time on it. I took it 2 summers in a row. And then I did like kind of the same technique that I used to learn to read Arabic, which is that once I got the grammar, I got a dictionary and I got like something I wanted to read, and I just sort of brute force translated my way through it. And I like wrote like the world's most crap translation, of it. But it would like force things into my head. It's the only way to describe it. Not that it's producing a brilliant product. And I'm still incredibly slow with Yiddish. It takes like I can read maybe 5 or 6 pages a day with much dictionary. But the thing is, it's that you can't write about the Bund if you don't know, if you're not able to read Yiddish, because they were so committed and so devoted to this language. Probably the way that I don't know, like a lot of Kurdish people, right, are so devoted to the Kurdish language, even though maybe it would be more practical to, speak a majority language. There's still, flourishing Kurdish bookshops everywhere because Kurdish people view it as something that's very worth preserving and something very intrinsic to them. I mean, that's how the Bund, in my opinion, viewed Yiddish.
You're drawn to the Bund, obviously, through the story and the connection of your great-grandfather, and obviously the ideas that are emanating from the works. The Bund are highly, as you're saying, socialist. They are from the sort of the early revolutionary era of socialism in Europe. Do you describe yourself as a socialist? Are you a party member?
I mean, I'm a democratic socialist, and I'm a member of DSA, which isn't really a political party. I don't know how to properly describe.
Does that still exist? That sort of, socialist. I guess if there's a socialist party, maybe it would. Yeah.
I mean, in America, it's different, obviously, everywhere in the world. But in America, there are communist and socialist parties, but they tend to be like extremely small, and in my opinion, very cultish, and in my opinion, not serious political forces.
Right, but you worked on or you campaigned for Bernie Sanders.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I ran. Well, first of all, I spoke at his events. I drew them, and also, my father is Puerto Rican, and I ran like Boricua para Bernie events where we would like phone bank in Spanish, and I'm pretty proud because like one of my events we heavily phone banked to Spanish-speaking workers in Iowa, and those were one of the communities that flipped Iowa for Bernie. So I'm like, did my little part. Yeah.
Well, that must have been really inspiring and also enlightening to some degree.
Yeah, and I mean, but yeah, I consider myself a democratic socialist, and that's like the tradition that's the tradition I fall into. And I think I always put like the emphasis on democratic, not in terms of the terrible, stupid, corrupt Democratic Party in America, but in terms of a socialism that is not authoritarian and that values human freedom.
Right. And one of the things that we're thinking about on this day of the festival is, this is day 3. We're dealing with ideas of literature and politics and literature in action, and how sort of ideas and narratives can disseminate, grow out of nothing, take over the imaginations of a group, and then just emerge into the real world. And, how much of the contemporary situation are you drawing on modern or classical texts? And what are you using? There's your research on the Bund must have also led you elsewhere, or even within the Bund. What can we relate to? What are you?
What am I reading?
What are you reading?
I've been reading a lot of Russian stuff. I just finished reading Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry, and his Odessa Tales, which I love so much. I'm also very slowly in Arabic. I'm reading Frankenstein in Baghdad, which is so dark and brilliant. I always try to I'm usually reading like books in a few different languages at the same time, because I'm trying not to like lose any of my abilities in any of them, though it always feels like giving life support to many dying people all at once. In terms of the Bund's relationship to literature is very interesting. They were very, very involved with the promotion of what I would call secular Yiddish literature, by which I mean like Yiddish literature that were novels about people, that, as opposed to tales about rabbis. And especially towards the middle period in Poland, they worshipped these people like Sholem Aleichem or Ayel Peretz or Mendele Sofar. They worship these people like the way that I think a lot of Russians might worship, a Pushkin or a Tolstoy, right? They had a huge regard for these writers and these poets as sort of like keepers of the national soul, even if none of these people were themselves, party members. And, Bundist newspapers did tons of work. I mean, they weren't just like these dry party sheets. They were also publishing like, contemporary fiction of their era in Yiddish that like a Jewish worker, like my great grandfather, could find himself reflected in. He could find his experiences reflected in and talked about. In America, when they came there too, there was an early generation of people who had kept their Yiddish. And they many of them were sweatshop workers, but they had a very, very active poetry scene. They wrote really, some pretty gorgeous stuff, in my opinion. And one of the ironies about the Bund is that, in my opinion, the Bund after World War II, while they tried to be a political force, they were too small, but also too poor and traumatized and too scattered all over the world to effectively be one. I remember I asked a friend, I was like, why didn't your mom rebuild the party? And my friend just looked at me and she was like, my mom just got out of a gulag and her whole family was murdered and she had no money and she was living in a country where she didn't speak the language. Like, leave my mom alone. What the hell?
The last thing she wants to do is start a revolution.
But what they did do, and what they did successfully do, and what they transmitted, was that they kept secular Yiddish alive, in as much as it is alive, and it's very much on life support. But the fact that I took these intensive summer classes to read this literature is directly because of the work of the Bund. One of my teachers was she was the daughter of a Bundist, and that literature and the preservation of that literature and their language, I think, is their strongest post-war legacy that they created. And that's like the gift that they still gave us, that like someone like me, even though my mother didn't speak Yiddish, just except for a few phrases, someone like me can go back and I can learn this language and I can read things that my great-grandfather wrote. They preserved that linguistic link to the past, even if they weren't able to preserve themselves as a political force.
You're able to connect with some of their work, and you learned your way around Yiddish and their work. Do you think that the future of sort of political Judaism, as it emerges, as we were talking about, new different groups coming into the political sphere, changing the narrative, or at least trying to, do you think that there are sort of groups and works from the past that can be relevant to that? Or do you think that a lot of what we'll see in the future in terms of organizing might be less sort of with personal maybe sectarian backgrounds and more grounded on sort of transnational, transreligious, alternative sort of futures? In a way.
I think the latter. The position of Jews in America, I can't speak to Israel, but I speak for America only, is so different than it was in Poland, that the Bundist method of organizing, it doesn't apply here. Jews in America, are not all of them, like not my family certainly, but many of them, are pretty well off. They're not like being banned from university, right? Like they're not all being, forced to live in certain neighborhoods. There isn't that sort of like visceral, like constant crap that they got in Poland. They're not a racialized minority in the same way, even though, neo-Nazis occasionally shoot up synagogues here. And also, what kept Jews together, right, in Poland was they all spoke the same language and they lived in the same areas. And there was like, millions of them, like sort of, in a pretty homogenous group. Jews in America, they come from all over the world. They're not just, Polish Yiddish speaking Jews. Like there's lots of, Jews from Syria, right, or Iraq or Iran, who have very, very different histories. A lot of them, are quite religious. A lot of them also are like super assimilated and, don't necessarily like, marry Jewish people. My partner's not Jewish. And so I think the Bund came out of Jews being a racialized minority. In many ways, it reminds me a lot of a Puerto Rican political group, which is called the Young Lords, which was a revolutionary socialist Puerto Rican party that emerged in Chicago and New York in the 1960s, and that worked with the Black Panthers a lot. And they also were a group that, was concerned with a combination of like ethnic pride, which wasn't, racist at all, but, they were proud to be Puerto Ricans. They didn't want to be told that they were like stupid idiot peons all the time. They're proud of their language.
Right.
They had kind of like quasi paramilitary stuff, but they also, organized health and food programs and education programs for their very, very working class neighborhoods. And to me, that type of organization makes the most sense when you are a racialized minority. And it's something that, needs to take place in addition to transnational, non-sectarian sort of like general organizing. Personally, like as someone who, gets on the streets a lot and considers myself a socialist, I don't organize too much politically in exclusively Jewish spaces, though, I certainly have done some things. And I tend to, organize more in spaces that are about, tenants' rights, or that are about, police abuse, that are just sort of general spaces.
On that note, would you say that your project is an academic project, a personal project, or is it also a political project?
I think it's a political and literary project. I always loathe to say that anything I do is academic because I'm completely lacking in any sort of academic qualifications. I didn't graduate college, so though there will be footnotes. I don't know. Maybe that makes it academic. I often also feel like it's a project of necromancy, right? Of the resurrection of the dead, if only for the span of reading something and bringing them back to life and allowing them to whisper to the present.
You got to work alongside AOC. Did you meet her personally? Did you work alongside her?
I met AOC twice. Once it was at a Puerto Rican protest after Maria, which is the big hurricane that killed 4,000 people. So we were both there at that protest. And then I met her on the campaign trail for Bernie. But when we did this video, it was actually mostly I interacted with her through my friend Naomi Klein, who co-wrote the video with her. And I mean, she's brilliant. Like, I think AOC is the best political communicator in America that I have seen in forever. And I feel so lucky to have gotten to, do something with her, because she is, she's like pride of New York,
Right. I mean, she's the pride of people all over the world. She really has inspired people everywhere to believe that anything is possible if you just know how to organize it.
Exactly. That it doesn't all have to be either like rapid plunge into fascism or else where we're all like serfs for Amazon. Those aren't our two options.
And that you can do it in style too. You can do it by bringing the best out of people, bringing the best color out of people, bringing the noise to the table. And it doesn't also have to be so academic and ineffective.
Exactly. Like, I remember when it was one of the first things that happened after she got elected, but she wasn't even in office yet. And they did a profile of her in some magazine, and she looked, beautiful and beautifully dressed, as she always does. And all of these right-wing dumbasses started whining and screaming, and they're like, how dare a socialist look this good, basically. It's a hypocrite, it's wrong. And she just said, like, you better get used to me looking good.
That's brilliant. Yeah. I guess on that note, to leave us with your thoughts, how much of where we are is a reflection of where we've been, and how much do you think is a reflection of where we're headed?
I think the future hits different places at different times, right? The bad futures and the good futures. So after Maria happened after Maria hit in Puerto Rico, I like most people, Puerto Rican background, I was very affected by that emotionally. And I got on the first plane that I was able to. It was about 10 days after it struck. And when I saw like what the complete disinvestment and state abandonment looked like my friend's barrio didn't get running water or power for months and months and months and months and months. And like even to get like solar power, they scavenged broken solar panels from the side of the road and taped them together. So they like did like 60% or whatever of capacity. It was when I saw what it looked like firsthand, a completely corrupt, incompetent, disinvested state. I think a lot of Lebanese people, might have recognized, that sort of corrupt thief state that's going on in Puerto Rico. Yeah, exactly. It just doesn't give a shit, right? Like it's the whole hurricane. It wouldn't have even been so bad if they hadn't been robbing everything blind for forever. And
exactly.
If they had, yeah, it's there's some real transnational solidarities that I feel like Puerto Rico and Lebanon that bond over on this. But to me, I was like, this is one vision of like the apocalypse, and it's hitting here. But then you go back to New York, and unless you had family there or stuff, it wasn't hitting in New York. New York was not being faced with the apocalypse yet. So when I think about this, I think about things. Time hitting everywhere differently. Some places seeing the brunt of climate change right now and burning to a crisp. Others not even noticing it and just enjoying, the nice balmy weather in November. And I think, the interactions between the inescapable past and the inescapable future are falling different places, different times.
As maybe they always have.
Absolutely.
I did forget to ask you about this, so I would like maybe to just for you to mention that you are working on a book on the Jewish Bund. Am I right?
Yes, I am. I am about 17,000 words into it. I don't know when it's going to be done, but yes, I am writing a book, and I mean that's why I'm spending so much time with my head in archives and learning to read Yiddish and stuff, so that I could really do them justice. Because there have been academic books on the Bund, and not even like academic books on the whole history, but academic books on certain periods that are very, very, very good books. And then there's memoirs of some Bundists, which are also wonderfully written books. But I have, as far as I know, there's no history of the Bund in English that's like a popular history that you can like give to a 20-year-old, and so they can be inspired by it and want to like dive into it. And so that's what I'm trying to write. I'm trying to write a history of the book that is relevant and thrilling and sometimes sexy even, and that makes people desperately want to read it and want to know about it. And I think that there's a place for that in addition to like all this really brilliant academic work that's been done on the group.
Of course, it sounds like that might be the first movie we see on the Bund.
I hope so.
Molly Crabapple, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, my absolute honor. Thank you so much for having me.